Welcome back, March 16th, 2021. Jimmy Kimmel last night made a point I don't think he intended to make. He said it's hard to blame people for not wanting a vaccine when every piece of information they've received about COVID has contradicted every other piece. He was trying a joke that didn't work. It landed flat, but instead he did end up speaking to a great truth. We went, as we've played the audio, from a lot of advice to a lot of contradictory advice from the likes of the Surgeon General, Anthony Fauci, the CDC, you name it. All the scientists we're supposed to listen to and respect. The most obvious one, but by no means the only one, no masks to two masks. It's just one of many examples. Remember when we were worried about surface contact? Remember when we wiped down grocery bags, sometimes debating whether it's better to leave them outside in the sun before bringing them in? It was all just a year ago. Remember when a mask was more important than a vaccine, as the CDC director told us last year? Remember when we would not get a vaccine within a year, as Anthony Fauci said several times? Remember when Anthony Fauci admitted to lying about herd immunity, something I thought would be or should be a firing offense? It was only 3 months ago when he said, quote, when polls said only about half of all Americans would take a vaccine, I was saying herd immunity would take 70 to 75%. Then when newer surveys said 60% or more would take it, I thought, I can nudge this up a bit. So I went to 80, 85, close quote. He said he felt he could change the number because, quote, my gut feeling that the country was finally ready to hear what I really think, close quote. Unbelievable, really, except too many are told we have to believe them. So anything he has said is supposed to be believable at any time. He says it just in that very moment, regardless of whether it contradicts what he said the weeks or months before, where he was saying something entirely 180 degrees different. Now the distancing is an issue. Please understand that I think every single thing is an issue. That not one thing, not one piece of advice or expertise from the government has been consistent or right, even though too many citizens hang on to every word of Fauci's and the CDC with a martinet dedication and officiousness as if it comes from Mount Sinai or Mount Olympus. If I might quote Tucker Carlson from yesterday, so when they told us to stay far apart from each other last spring in the name of public health, it was an enormous sacrifice, whether or not we understood it at the time. Because this was a trusting and law-abiding country, we obeyed that order. We barely grumbled about it. We assumed they knew best. Stay 6 feet from each other. That was social distancing. It was the law, and most of us followed the law. But where did that law come from? Who did the scientific research that determined 6 feet was the safest distance apart from other people that you could be? Somebody should have asked that question last spring, but as far as we know, nobody did. Fauci again and again promoted it. So do still all of our buildings, offices, stores, and indeed the CDC. Where did it come from? It came from a German scientist in the 1890s. But not even the World Health Organization bought it. They were, and today, tell us the right distance was and is They told us it was 3.2 feet. That is to say 1 meter. Not in America. We had to double it based on zero science, or at least based on nothing more than the science from the time when William McKinley was president. Why do I mention McKinley? Well, that was the 1890s, and science was so advanced then, he said sarcastically, that no X-ray was used on McKinley after he was shot. So the bullet in him was not found. And of course, there were no antibiotics either. So he died. That's the level of an advancement of science we've been lectured on. Again, with great martinet officiousness to distance 6 feet. Again, some of us thought it was a crock, in part because not even the WHO was promoting it. Indeed, there were journals around over the past year saying 6 feet was not the necessary minimum, including The Lancet. And now we know even more so that is the case. Back to Tucker, if I might. Last week, the journal Clinical Infectious Diseases found that the law of 6 feet of social distancing isn't actually real. It's not a law. It was a guess, and it's wrong. Researchers looked at coronavirus case rates in Massachusetts school districts that required 6 feet of social distancing and compared those with school districts that required only 3 feet of social distancing. Yes, there were some. Researchers found there was no statistically significant difference in coronavirus cases between the two. The study also controlled for coronavirus rates in the surrounding communities, and it was also true for adult staff members as well as children. It was not shoddy research. It was real. It was not a small sample. It was 537,336 students and 99,390 adults. Back to Tucker, because he's showing not only has the Mount Olympus science been wrong, indeed not science, but it's been political, and let us never forget it. Quote, last summer, dozens of public health experts exempted BLM from coronavirus restrictions, not because science demanded that BLM get a pass, but because they personally supported BLM. The so-called scientific community signed a letter that will forever live in infamy, claiming, quote, the risks of congregating during a global pandemic shouldn't keep people from protesting racism.
I grew up
the scourge of white
Christian
supremacy,
home.
the letter
Yeah,
said,
my
is a
parents really
lethal
taught-
public health issue that predates and contributes to COVID-19, close quote. So you thought COVID-19 may have escaped from a lab in Wuhan that was in part funded by the U.S. government with the knowledge of Tony Fauci. So maybe Tony Fauci and the government of China might have something to answer for. But now we learned from the scientific community that it wasn't any of that at all. It was your racism that caused COVID. Well, that makes sense. Remember, the letter said the scourge of white supremacy is a lethal public issue that predates and contributes to COVID-19. The letter was signed by over 1,200 so-called medical experts. Or, back to Jimmy Kimmel, it's hard to blame people for not wanting a vaccine when every piece of information about COVID has contradicted every other piece. But follow the science. Turns out all they meant was follow the political science. It's just that not enough people understood that. This is a problem, of course, of value-free political science, which has infected the social sciences since the 1950s. It's known as the problem of the fact-value distinction. And we need not go into it in depth here, but it basically dismisses notions of right and wrong in our political science. As Harry Jaffa put it in his very first book in the early 1950s, it was his doctoral dissertation. Quote, all values are now just preferences, and all preferences are essentially part of the realm of myth and outside the ambit of science. Thus, modern anthropology may deny the Nazis' assertions as to the inequality of the races by denying or criticizing any positive evidence that the Nazi scientists may bring forward in support of their doctrines. But the anthropologists, qua anthropologists, do not contest the right of the Nazis to be Nazis. They do not say that one ought not to be a Nazi and that the Nazis' treatment of their enemies is morally wrong. To the anthropologist, as to all value-free social science, the principles of National Socialism are one of an unlimited number of possible sets of principles, all such principles having an equal right to being accepted and followed, because there is no demonstrable or scientific basis for preferring one to the other. It's like cultural relativism, except now in the sciences. Joseph Mengele, Dr. Mengele, ironically enough or not, was, in fact, a trained anthropologist as well as a physician. And prior to becoming known as the Angel of Death, he was the recipient of the Iron Cross and known as, quote, mature, upright, reliable person who has the full confidence of his superiors and his subordinates. So when one goes back and looks at the past year, who was right, who was not, it's clear beyond peradventure the most prominent and pointed to scientists were not only wrong on a lot of advice, they also admitted to lying. And they dismissed that which those who placed different values, let us say, on our society and lives had to say. Issues of, say, mental health as well as physical. Issues of youth health as opposed to, say, obese and elderly health. issues of, say, suicide and drug and alcohol addiction, as opposed to, say, proving a sitting president incompetent. We were all the scourge, it turns out. Turns out, looking back over the year, though, the very first prominent piece published questioning whether we were about to go through was smart. It was from Heather MacDonald, and it was published 3 days more than 1 year ago, exactly, March 13th, 2020. She took a lot of heat, as did those of us who promoted her essay. It was titled, "Compared to What? The Misguided Response to COVID-19. There, she wrote, "What actually matters is whether or not the growing pandemic overwhelms our ability to ensure the well-being of U.S. residents with efficiency and precision. But fear of the disease, and not the disease itself, has already spoiled that for us. For we are about to watch destruction being wrought on the U.S. and the global economy from this unbridled panic." She concluded her piece this way. Rather than indiscriminately shutting down public events and travel, we should target prevention where it is most needed, in nursing homes and hospitals. This was exactly a year ago. It's hard to imagine that the panicked leaders and populists of today would have been able to triumph in the last century's world wars. America's colleges sent off thousands of their young men to fight and die in those wars. Those students went off with conviction and courage. Currently, colleges and universities are shutting down with no hint of the virus in their vicinity. Would today's panicked leaders and populists be able to triumph in the face of a world war or some other legitimately comparable threat? Let's hope that we do not have to find out. I leave it there, but only with one last thought. When society tells you Dr. Seuss is bad for children, but Cardi B is not, are you happy with what all your social scientists have wrought? And when members of the scientific community tell you to change everything and keeps changing its mind on what needs to be changed, even contradicting previous changes along the way, even to the point of being demonstrably wrong as a matter of fact, even admitting they were deliberately misleading you, are you happy with what the mantra of follow the science has wrought? Science, political or physical, should not be value-free or a matter of ideological preference. You see what it leads to, or don't you? Quite yet. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.